October 24, 1942. Alamein, Egypt. British Sherman tank crews were about to discover something their German opponents would never understand. The math was brutal and simple. Spot an enemy Panzer at 1,000 wide. Stop your 32-ton tank. Wait for the rocking to settle. Aim your gun, fire, 4.2 seconds minimum. In tank combat, the crew that shoots second doesn't go home. Every army in the world, German, British, Soviet, American, lived by the same iron law. Fire while moving equals waste ammunition. The vibration, the bouncing hull, the swaying gun barrel, all guaranteed misses beyond 200 wide. Aberdeen Proving Ground had the test data to prove it. Moving tanks hit targets less than 10% of the time. Then something impossible happened. A handful of British Sherman crews, engines still roaring at 8 mph, fired their 75mm guns and hit German tanks that were sitting perfectly still. The Panzer crews never saw it coming. They had stopped to aim exactly as doctrine demanded and died before their gunners could center their crosshairs. German intelligence reports that weak noted abnormal accuracy from American tanks in motion. What they didn't know was that a 34-year-old Westinghouse engineer named Clinton Hanna had broken the most fundamental rule of armored warfare, and the device that did it weighed less than 300 lb. The death sentence hiding inside tank combat doctrine was simple mathematics. And by 1939, every army in the world had written it into their field manuals with blood-bought certainty. A tank advancing across open ground at 12 mph experienced constant motion, the hull pitching over uneven terrain, the suspension compressing and rebounding, the entire vehicle rocking on its tracks like a ship in moderate seas. Mount a 9-FT gun barrel weighing 1,500 lb to that moving platform, and physics delivered its verdict. Accuracy beyond 200 wadi became a statistical impossibility. The gun tube bounced, the sights jiggled, the target danced in and out of the gunner's crosshairs with every bump and depression. Test after test at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland confirmed what common sense already knew. Moving tanks firing at 300 yards hit stationary targets less than 10% of the time. At 800 YD, the hit rate dropped below 5%. The numbers weren't opinions. They were measurements repeated across hundreds of test runs with different crews, different tanks, different weather conditions. The conclusion was inescapable and universal. So every nation that fielded armored forces in 1940 adopted the same tactical doctrine: advance, halt, fire, advance. The sequence wasn't just recommended practice. It was survival protocol written in the wreckage of tanks that had tried otherwise. British tankers learned this lesson in blood during the French campaign of May 1940 charging. German positions while firing on the move wasted ammunition and revealed your position without effect. The smart crews lived by a brutal rhythm. Spot the enemy, hit the brakes, wait 3 to 5 seconds for the vehicle to settle. Let the gunner center his reticle, squeeze the trigger, then move immediately before return fire arrived. Those 3 to 5 seconds of vulnerability were the price every tanker paid for accurate fire. German doctrine said it. British doctrine said it. Soviet doctrine said it, and when the United States Armored Force published Field Manual 1712 in 1941, American doctrine said it too. The tank will advance, halt, fire, advance. It wasn't timid advice from theorists who'd never seen combat. It was the tactical consensus of every major military power forged in the reality of what tanks could and couldn't do. The human cost of that doctrine played out in crew testimonies from the North African desert, where American M3 Lee medium tanks first met German armor in combat. The interviews were fragmentary, delivered by exhausted men still processing what they'd survived, but the fear came through in every sentence. "You see the enemy tank," one sergeant said, hands shaking around a canteen cup. "You yell at your driver to stop. You're screaming at your gunner to aim faster, and you're praying, actually praying, that your guy gets his shot off before theirs does." Another crew commander described the mathematics of terror with uncomfortable precision. German Panzer IV has a high-velocity 75mm gun. At 1,000 to 1 it'll punch through our armor like cardboard. We have to stop to shoot back. That's 4, maybe 5 seconds where we're a stationary target and they're aiming at us. You do that math enough times and eventually you're the one who stops forever. The tactical problem was universal, but it crystallized with particular urgency for the United States Army in the spring of 1939. War was coming. Anyone with eyes could see that. And America's tank force was a paper organization, with obsolete equipment and untested doctrine. The Ordnance Department, responsible for developing and procuring armored vehicles, understood they were starting from behind. German Panzer divisions had torn through Poland. British and French armor doctrine was being written in real time under Wehrmacht pressure. The Soviets had combat experience from border clashes with Japan. America had training exercises and theories, so an ordnance sent a specification request to Westinghouse Electric Corporation that spring. The language was direct to the point of bluntness. Develop a system to keep tank guns steady while the vehicle moves over rough terrain at speeds up to 15 mph. No engineering details, no suggested approaches, just the desired outcome and an 18-month timeline. The contract value was classified not because the dollar amount was sensitive, but because acknowledging you were trying to solve this problem told potential enemies you thought it could be solved. The penalty for failure wasn't stated because failure was expected. Every major military had studied gun stabilization. Every major military had concluded it was theoretically possible and practically impossible. Gyroscopes existed. Naval vessels used them for fire control. Servo mechanisms existed. Aircraft autopilots relied on them. But integrating those technologies into a 32-ton fighting vehicle that would be driven by teenagers across North African deserts and European mudfields that would be maintained by mechanics with minimal technical training that would experience temperatures from -20 to +113 that would absorb the shock of incoming fire and the recoil of outgoing fire and the constant vibration of engines and tracks. The engineering challenges weren't just difficult. They were compounding. Each solution created new problems. Clinton Hanna received the assignment because he was a specialist in precision control systems, and at age 34, he'd built a reputation for patient problem-solving rather than dramatic breakthroughs. He'd worked on naval fire control projects where gyroscopes kept guns stable on rolling ships. He understood servo mechanisms that could sense motion and generate corrective force faster than human reaction time. But a tank was a different animal entirely. Ships rolled in predictable patterns. Aircraft moved through three-dimensional space where control surfaces could compensate. A tank crashed over Earth in chaotic motion. Random bumps, sudden drops, lateral lurches from track throw, violent recoil impulses from the main gun, and the gun itself was massive. A 75mm cannon with a barrel 9 ft long. The entire assembly weighing 1/500 lb, all of it, can levered forward from a turret mount. Keep that steady while the vehicle beneath it bucked and heaved. The whispers started immediately. Ordnance officers called it a fantasy project. Tank crews who heard rumors dismissed it outright. One more complicated thing to break down when you need it most. Even within Westinghouse, experienced engineers shook their heads. Gyroscopes belonged in controlled environments, laboratories, ships, aircraft, not in steel boxes driven across broken ground by frightened men under fire. Hanna's first prototype is 2 gyroscopes for redundancy, a sensible engineering decision that produced an unwieldy system. Summer 1940 tests at Aberdeen showed promise. The gun stayed within 3 of elevation while the tank moved at 12 mph over moderate terrain. Reading sounded precise until you calculated what it meant downrange. At 800 wood, 3 of elevation error translated to 42 F to vertical dispersion. You might hit the ground in front of the enemy tank. You might hit the sky above it. You probably wouldn't hit the tank. The system was too complex, too heavy, too slow to respond to the rapid changes in vehicle attitude. Back to the drawing board. The breakthrough came under pressure that would have crushed most engineering programs. December 7, 1941 erased every comfortable timeline. Pearl Harbor meant production schedules that had seemed aggressive now looked dangerously slow. The M4 Sherman medium tank designed to replace the inadequate M3 Lee was scheduled to begin production in February 1942. Hanna had 8 months to deliver a stabilization system that worked, could be mass-produced, and wouldn't require a mechanical engineering degree to operate. 8 months to perfect what every military establishment in the world considered impossible. He abandoned the 2 gyroscope approach entirely. Redundancy was an engineer safety blanket, but safety blankets added weight, complexity, and failure points. The solution that emerged was conceptually radical. A single anticipating gyroscope that predicted gun movement before it happened, rather than reacting after the fact. Traditional stabilization worked like Alamein, trying to balance a broom on his palm, constant small corrections chasing the problem. Hanna's system worked like a man, who could see the future half a second ahead and prevent the broom from tilting in the first place. The gyroscope spun at 10,000 revolutions per minute. fast enough that its angular momentum resisted any attempt to change its orientation. Mount that gyroscope to sense the gun's elevation axis, and any upward or downward movement of the tank hull would try to tilt the gyroscope. The gyroscope would resist that tilt, generating a signal proportional to the disturbance. Feed that signal into a hydraulic servo valve, and the valve could drive a piston that pushed the gun in the opposite direction, canceling the motion before it became visible in the gunner's sight. The entire system weighed less than 300 lb and integrated directly with the Sherman's existing oil-gear hydraulic turret traverse system, pulling power from the same pump that rotated the turret. The elegance was in the integration. No separate power source, no redundant controls, just a black box that inserted itself between the gunner's hand control and the gun itself. When the system was engaged, the gunner still aimed normally, but the gun responded with supernatural steadiness. Aberdeen proving ground tests in September 1941 delivered numbers that forced even the skeptics to pause. Sherman, prototype with stabilizer engaged. Target at 800 yards. Tank speed 12 miles per hour over rutted test course. 7 hits out of 10 shots. Same tank, same crew, same course with stabilizer disengaged. 1 hit out of 10. The difference wasn't marginal. It was categorical. Production began immediately with every M4 Sherman, except the 105mm howitzer versions receiving the Westinghouse stabilizer as standard equipment. By August 1942, the 1st Sherman battalions were forming up for deployment to North Africa, and each tank carried the black box that ordnance officers had called a fantasy 18 months earlier. But there was a problem that no one had anticipated during the rush to production, a problem that wouldn't reveal itself until the hardware reached the men who had to use it. The technical manual for setup and operation was 47 pages long. The calibration process required a skilled technician and 2 hours of careful adjustment. Oil pressure had to be verified. Gyroscope spin-up time had to be monitored. Electrical connections had to be checked in sequence. 1 loose connection, 1 air bubble in the hydraulic line, 1 miscalibrated sensor, and the entire system would fail. Or worse, fight against the gunner's commands and make aiming impossible. Most Sherman battalions forming up in the summer of 1942 didn't have a single man trained on the system beyond a cursory familiarization lecture. The crews were draftees and volunteers who'd been civilians 6 months earlier, learning to drive 32-ton vehicles and load ammunition, and communicate by radio and execute fire commands and navigate by map, and perform field maintenance on engines and transmissions and suspensions. Adding a complex electromechanical hydraulic stabilization system to that training burden was theoretically possible. In practice, it was one technical specialty, too many for the time available. When the first Shermans rolled off transport ships in North Africa, crews looked at the unfamiliar controls beside the gunner's seat, flipped through the intimidating technical manual, and made a decision that seemed entirely reasonable. They switched the stabilizer to off and went to war the way doctrine said they should, stopping to shoot like every other tank crew in every other army. The British ETHMI received 252 M4 Shermanson the weeks before the Alamein offensive, and their approach differed in one critical detail. Westinghouse had embedded technical representatives with British maintenance units, specifically to train crews on stabilizer operation. It wasn't comprehensive training. There wasn't time, but it was direct instruction from men who understood the system's temperament. Some crews absorbed the lessons and practiced the setup until the 27 steps became automatic. Most ignored it, trusting doctrine and experience over unfamiliar technology. But a handful of tank commanders saw potential in the black box, and on October 24, 1942, the potential became lethality. British 9th Armored Brigade advanced against German Panzer III and Panzer IV positions at 200 yards in the gray dawn light. Doctrine said, "Close the distance. Stop. Engage." But the crews with stabilizers engaged discovered something that changed the equation. They could fire while still moving forward at 8 miles, and their shots landed on target. Tote-free shot, the stabilizer couldn't eliminate all motion, and gunner skills still mattered, but enough shots to matter tactically. German tank commanders trained to expect the universal stop, shoot, move pattern were caught in mid-maneuver. They'd spotted the advancing Shermans, begun their own stops, waited for their vehicles to settle, started bringing their guns to bear, and died before their gunners could center their reticles. The Shermans fired first, and in tank combat, first usually meant only. The after-action reports from German units noted abnormal accuracy from American tanks in motion, with the careful language of professional soldiers describing something they didn't understand. One captured Panzer IV crew interviewed by British intelligence officers stated it plainly. "We stopped to fire, strained, and as always works." The American gun was already aimed at us. No German tank had this capability. The Panther wouldn't enter service until mid-1943, and even then it would lack gun stabilization. The Tiger, vaunted for its 88mm gun and thick armor, traversed its turret manually when power drive failed, which it did frequently, requiring 720 full revolutions of a hand crank to rotate 360 degrees. The Americans had delivered a capability the Germans didn't know was possible, and German engineers who examined captured Shermans couldn't replicate it. The gyroscope technology existed in German industry, but integrating it into a combat vehicle that worked reliably under field conditions, that was Hanna's breakthrough, and it was harder than it looked. The brutal mathematics of Alamein proved the concept. Sherman crews with stabilizers engaged in proper training achieved 70% hit rates at ranges from 300 to 200 YD, while their vehicles were still in motion. Crews without stabilizers following conventional doctrine, 8 to 12% hit rates. The difference wasn't miraculous. It was 2 seconds. The stabilizer kept the gun on target through the deceleration phase when crews decided to stop and fire. They could squeeze the trigger the instant their vehicle halted. Gun already zeroed on the enemy. No aiming delay required. German crews lost 4 to 5 seconds bringing their guns to bear after stopping, settling their sights, finding the target again. In engagements measured in heartbeats, those seconds were fatal. The United States 1st Armored Division landed in North Africa in November 1942 with over 300 Shermans, and the stabilizers had disabled in 80% of them. The reasons were entirely logical from the perspective of tank commanders trying to keep their crews alive with minimal training time. The system was complex. Setup required precise calibration that field mechanics hadn't been trained to perform. In the Tunisian desert, sand infiltrated everything: engines, transmissions, turret rings, and delicate electrical equipment seemed like an invitation to failure. Veteran tank officers, the men who trained the crews and would lead them into combat, cited practical concerns that sounded like wisdom. Too complicated, unreliable in these conditions. Breaks too easily and then you've got a gun that won't aim at all. The stabilizer remained installed. Removing it would have required depot-level maintenance. But the switch stayed in the off position and the system gathered dust inside vehicles designed around it. The field manual that should have supported the technology instead undermined it, with language that revealed how doctrine lagged behind capability. Field Manual 17-12 Tank Gunnery, published in April 1943 after American tanks had been in combat for 6 months, included a passage that became the official excuse for every crew that disabled their stabilizer. Firing with the 75mm gun while moving is inaccurate and causes an uneconomical expenditure of ammunition. Do it only in an emergency and at ranges of 600 YD or less. The manual acknowledged the stabilizer's existence in technical diagrams, but framed fire on the move as a desperation tactic rather than a tactical advantage. Crews read that passage and concluded the Ordnance Department itself didn't trust the system enough to change doctrine. Why should they? The maintenance crisis compounded skepticism into active rejection. The stabilizer required 4 things to function: correct hydraulic oil pressure from the turret traverse pump, a gyroscope spun up to 10,000 RPM and held there, electrical power to the servo control unit, and precise calibration of the sensing mechanism that translated gyroscope signals into hydraulic commands. In depot conditions with trained technicians, setup was methodical. In field conditions with mechanics who'd received a half-day familiarization course, setup was guesswork. One air bubble in the hydraulic line caused erratic gun movement. One corroded electrical connection made the servo fight against the gunner's commands. One improperly calibrated sensor caused the gun to hunt, oscillating up and down in search of stability it couldn't find. When crews tried the stabilizer and experienced these failures, word spread through tank battalions with the speed of survival information. The stabilizer's junk. Turn it off before it gets you killed. No one blamed the inadequate training or the rushed maintenance procedures. They blamed the technology. The deadly consequences revealed themselves at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where American armor met German Panzer forces in the first major engagement between the two armies. 183. American tanks were destroyed over 4 days of fighting. The tactical failures were numerous. Poor coordination between units, inadequate reconnaissance, defensive positions chosen without regard for fields of fire. But the technical failure was invisible because no one knew it existed. American Shermans with stabilizers disabled followed stop doctrine against German tanks using the same doctrine. The engagements came down to crew training, tactical positioning, and weapon performance. In those categories, experienced German crews with superior optics and longer-range guns held the advantage. German after-action reports praised the mechanical reliability of captured American tanks and noted their excellent ergonomics, but concluded, enemy crews stopped to fire as expected. Standard engagement protocols remain effective. The Americans had brought a secret weapon to the battlefield and never unwrapped it. The turning point came not from high-level tactical analysis, but from individual curiosity and obsessive preparation. Lieutenant Joseph McCoy, 26th Tank Battalion, 66th Armored Regiment, 2nd Armored Division, spent the Atlantic crossing to Sicily, reading the Westinghouse technical manual cover to cover, not skimming it, reading it. He worked through the calibration procedures on paper, memorizing the sequence. He studied the troubleshooting charts until he could diagnose failures by symptom. Other platoon leaders ran poker games or slept or wrote letters home. McCoy drilled his crew on stabilizer setup until the 27 steps became automatic. Verify oil pressure gauge reads 180 to 220 psi. Engage master power switch. Wait for gyro spin-up indicator. Check servo response with test displacement. Calibrate 0 point with gun level. Engage stabilizer clutch. Verify gun hold's position during simulated motion. His gunner could perform the sequence in under 10 minutes without consulting the manual. Other platoon leaders mocked him quietly. McCoy is wasting time on that contraption. Wait till the first breakdown. Then we'll see. The Gullah beachhead on July 10, 1943 provided the laboratory. German Panzer IV tanks counterattacked the Allied landing zones in the kind of mobile engagement that doctrine said favored the defender. German crews knew the terrain, had prepared positions, and could use maneuver to offset numerical disadvantage. McCoy's platoon advanced with stabilizers engaged, and he briefed his crews on something the British had learned at Alamein. You didn't fire on the move for accuracy at long range. You fired on the move for 2 reasons, suppression and preparation. Suppressive fire kept German crews buttoned up, reluctant to expose themselves to spot accurately. It degraded their ability to coordinate and maneuver. It wasn't about hitting them at 800 YD while moving. It was about forcing them to respect your fire while you closed distance, and when you reached 600 YD and made the decision to stop and deliver a killing shot, your gun was already on target. No aiming delay. Crosshairs exactly where you'd left them. Squeeze trigger. Absorb recoil fire again if needed. The German crews went through their practice sequence. Stop vehicle. Wait for settling. Center sight picture. Acquire target. Aim. Fire. By the time they completed that sequence, McCoy's gunner had already put a round into their hole. The word traveled through 2nd Armored Division like electricity. Crews who mastered the stabilizer gained 3 to 4 critical seconds in every engagement. It wasn't about revolutionary tactics or dramatic battlefield miracles. It was about cutting aiming time to 0 when you stopped. The gyroscope held the crosshairs exactly where the gunner had placed them 30 seconds earlier before the tank started moving. Before terrain intervened, before anything changed. Stop the tank and the gun was ready. No searching for target, no compensation for movement, just fire. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department, stung by Caserine and confused by mixed field reports, conducted formal testing at Fort Knox in the summer of 1943, with controlled conditions and instrumented measurements. The results were published as technical bulletins that reached every armored unit. Stabilizer-equipped crews with proper training reduced time to first shot by an average of 4.2 seconds compared to non-stabilized tanks. Hit probability at 800 WID increased from 45% to 68% for stabilizer-trained crews under controlled test conditions. In combat, where stress and chaos degraded performance, the advantage was less dramatic but still measurable. Properly trained crews averaged 55 to 60% hit rates versus 30 to 40% for conventional crews. The data forced a quiet revision of doctrine. The next printing of Field Manual, 1712, would include updated guidance on stabilizer employment. But thousands of tank crews were already in combat, and changing doctrine in headquarters didn't change what men believed in the field. The stabilizer's reputation had been established by early failures and inadequate training. Recovering from that reputation required proof delivered in blood and survival. The Normandy Bauge country revealed the stabilizer's value in terrain that doctrine manuals hadn't anticipated. The hedge of northern France, thick earthen BMS crowned with centuries-old vegetation, creating natural walls between tiny fields, turned tank combat into knife fights at ranges under 300 wide. Of visibility was measured in vehicle lengths. Engagement windows lasted seconds. German crews dug into prepared positions with clear fields of fire down narrow. Lanes held every advantage of position and preparation. American Sherman crews advancing through. The Bauge needed every technical edge they could find. And by June 1944, enough crews had been trained on stabilizer employment that the system finally reached its intended battlefield role. The application was brutally practical. When a Sherman took fire and had to reverse rapidly out of a killing zone, the violent rocking motion from backing over uneven terrain at speed normally made aimed fire impossible. Crews with stabilizers engaged could shoot while rocking backward, the gyroscope keeping the gun steady through motion that would have thrown off any manual aim. Crews reported the effect with the matter-of-fact language of men describing tools that kept them alive. We can get 2 aimed shots off while reversing before the German tank can fire once. That's the difference between making it back to cover or burning in the lane. The stabilizer didn't eliminate danger. Nothing could in terrain that favored the defender so completely, but it compressed the window of vulnerability. From lethal to survivable, the compound advantage of American tank design became clear in these close-range engagements where multiple technical factors combined to create tactical superiority. Sherman turrets rotated 360 degrees in 15 seconds using electric-hydraulic power traverse, 20 per second of smooth-controlled rotation. A gunner could track a moving target continuously, the turret keeping pace with threat movement, while the stabilizer kept the gun steady in elevation. German Panther tanks vaunted for their sloped armor, and powerful 75mm L-70 gun rotated their turrets in 18 seconds at high speed. But the power traverse system was notoriously unreliable, prone to failure from combat damage or mechanical breakdown. When power traverse failed, Panther crews resorted to hand-cranking the turret at 0.36 degree per revolution, 720 complete revolutions to traverse 360 degree, in close combat where targets appeared suddenly and disappeared quickly. A Panther with failed power traverse was a pillbox with excellent armor and a gun that couldn't track. The German Tiger I, the heavy tank that dominated Allied nightmares and German propaganda, required 60 seconds for full turret rotation at low engine RPM. The hydraulic system drew power directly from the engine, so traverse speed depended on engine speed, and idling Tigers traversed at glacial pace. American crews learned to exploit this, force the Tiger to traverse, then move laterally faster than its turret could follow. The Sherman's 20 degrees S traverse rate meant American gunners could stay on target, while German crews struggled to keep up. Add the stabilizer to that equation. Gun steady during the Sherman's movement, ready to fire the instant the crew chose. And the technical advantages compounded into tactical dominance in exactly the kind of close-range, high-speed engagements the Bauge demanded. The revelation spread through armored units as crews compared notes and survival rates. Stabilizer-trained platoon reported consistently higher kill ratios and lower casualty rates than conventional platoon in the same battalion facing the same opposition. The data was anecdotal but compelling. Crews who trusted the system lived longer, even when German guns were superior, and the Panther's 75mm L-70 could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at ranges beyond 1,500 yards. American crews often fired first because they arrived at firing solution faster. The stabilizer kept the gun on target during approach. The power traverse tracked threat bearing. The gunner squeezed the trigger when geometry favored penetration, and the German crew was still bringing their gun to bear when the American round arrived. German tank crews interviewed after capture expressed consistent frustration with American fire control that they couldn't explain through conventional analysis. American tank turret control allows rapid engagement, one Panther commander stated in a detailed interrogation report. Crews demonstrate ability to fire accurately with minimal halt time. We must assume first shot advantage belongs to enemy. German engineers studied captured Shermans, photographed the stabilizer components, measured the gyroscope, traced the hydraulic lines, and reached a conclusion that vindicated Hanna's 18 months of obsessive engineering. The system was too complex for field production, in Germany's increasingly strained industrial system. The gyroscope required precision manufacturing. The servo control unit needed specialized electrical components. The integration with hydraulic systems demanded careful calibration. Germany could build the components barely, but couldn't manufacture them at scale with the reliability needed for combat vehicles. The stabilizer required an industrial base that could produce precision instruments by the thousands, and assumed they'd work correctly without individual tuning. Germany's artisan approach to tank production, where every vehicle received individual attention and adjustment, couldn't replicate the mass production precision the American system assumed as baseline. A captured German technical manual from Panther crews dated August 1944 included tactical guidance that acknowledged defeat without understanding its source. American tank turret control allows rapid engagement. Crews demonstrate ability to fire accurately with minimal halt time. Assume first shot advantage belongs to enemy. Compensate through superior positioning and use of terrain. The Germans had adapted their tactics to counter an advantage they couldn't match technically, falling back on the traditional Panzer virtues of crew skill and tactical placement. It was sound doctrine against a superior system, but it conceded the initiative. By September 1944, American Sherman production reached 200 tanks per month, and every vehicle rolled off the assembly line with the Westinghouse stabilizer installed as standard equipment. The setup procedures had been simplified through field feedback and engineering refinement. What took 12 hours of technician time in 1942 now took 4 hours of crew time in 1944. Training. Courses at Fort Knox dedicated entire days to stabilizer employment with instructors who'd survived combat explaining the system not as complicated technology, but as life-saving equipment. Crew training rates climbed from 15% in 1943 to 60% by autumn 1944. Hit rates for stabilizer trained crews peaked at 72% at combat ranges 300 to 1,000 yards in good visibility, with trained gunners and properly maintained systems. The Edge Clinton. Hannah had built in a Westinghouse laboratory was no standard equipment in the most produced tank of the war, integrated so completely that crews treated it as normal rather than revolutionary. The stabilizer's golden age lasted from day through the autumn of 1944, when American armor faced German tanks that were individually superior, but collectively overwhelmed by numbers, logistics, and integrated technical advantages that compounded into battlefield dominance. The Sherman wasn't invincible, far from it, but it was fast, reliable, and in the hands of properly trained crews, lethal at the ranges where most tank combat actually occurred. The mathematics that had seemed impossible in 1939 were no routine. Fire while moving, hit while moving, survive while moving. Wars aren't won by single inventions, but by the patient application of multiple advantages until the enemy runs out of counters. The reckoning arrived in the autumn of 1944, when American tank crews faced the uncomfortable mathematics of armor penetration versus armor thickness. The stabilizer delivered exactly what it promised: first shot advantage through faster target acquisition and reduced aiming time. But against German Panther tanks with frontal glacis armor 120 mm thick at 55 meters of slope, and Tiger tanks with frontal armor 185 mm thick, first shot wasn't enough if the round bounced off harmlessly. The Sherman 75 mm M3 gun could penetrate Panther frontal armor only at ranges under 300 yards with perfect perpendicular impact. Beyond that range, crews had to aim for side armor, turret rings, or track mechanisms, precision shots that required skill, nerve, and geometry that combat rarely provided. The stabilizer made crews faster, not invincible, and the battlefield sorted that distinction with brutal clarity. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the comprehensive test. Sherman battalions with fully trained stabilizer. Crews, men who'd survived Normandy and fought across France, who knew their equipment intimately and trusted it completely, reported first shot rates of 65% against German armor. The stabilizer worked as designed. Crews acquired targets faster, aimed faster, fired faster, but penetration rates against heavy German tanks told a different story. 22% of hits achieved kills against Panthers and Tigers engaging frontally. The stabilizer delivered the advantage it was designed to create. It just couldn't overcome physics. Kinetic energy at impact depended on projectile mass, velocity, and striking angle. The Sherman's gun fired a 15 lb projectile at 2600 ft/s. The Panther's gun fired a 15 lb. projectile at 3,100 ft per second. That velocity difference, translated directly into penetrating power, and no amount of fire control could compensate for it. American crews adapted through tactics that exploited the advantages they had. Mobility kept them alive. Shermans were faster cross-country than Panthers, more reliable mechanically than Tigers, easier to recover and repair when damaged. Numbers overwhelmed. For every Panther Germany produced, America built 5 Shermans, and the logistics trained to keep those Shermans fueled, armed, and maintained never broke. And the stabilizer still mattered because most tank combat occurred at ranges under 800 YD against targets other than heavy tanks. German Panzer IVs remained the backbone of panzer divisions, and against those, the Sherman's gun was adequate. Against towed anti-tank guns, fortified positions, and infantry, the Sherman was excellent. The stabilizer made all of those engagements faster and more lethal, even if it couldn't turn a 75mm gun into an 88. The 76mm M1 gun appeared in late 1944 as the Ordnance Department's answer to the penetration problem, and Sherman's mounting the longer gun received improved stabilizers calibrated for the new weapon's recoil characteristics. These crews achieved 70% hit rates at ranges exceeding $1,000 hit, while moving at 12 mph, performance unmatched by any other Army fielding tanks in large numbers. But production came too late to replace the majority of Sherman battalions. By war's end, roughly 30% of Shermans in Europe mounted the 76mm gun. The rest made dow with the original 75, compensating through crew skill, tactical positioning, and the stubborn reliability of systems that worked when everything else failed. The human testimony cut through statistical analysis with the clarity of lived experience. Sergeant Jim Bates, 4th Armored Division, wrote home in March 1945, with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who'd survived long enough to understand what kept him alive. Our tank isn't the strongest. Everyone knows that. German Panthers have better armor, bigger guns, all the technical advantages. But when we roll up on a fight, we shoot first every single time. The other guys are still cranking their turrets around, still settling their sights, still trying to get their guns on target, and we're already putting rounds downrange. That black box under the gunner's seat, the thing everyone said was junk back in training, that's what keeps us alive. I don't care what the armor specs say. I care that my gunner can fire 2 seconds faster than theirs. And in this business, 2 seconds is everything. The final statistics told the story that individual battles obscured of 49,324 Sherman tanks produced between 1942 and 1945. Approximately 47,000 featured the Westinghouse stabilizer as standard equipment. Estimated crew training rate reached 60% by war's end, up from 15% in early 1943. Measured advantage in controlled tests, 3.88 seconds faster to first aim shot versus non-stabilized tanks. In combat conditions with all the variables of terrain, visibility, crew fatigue, and mechanical wear, the real-world advantage was smaller, perhaps to 2.5 seconds, but still decisive. Tank combat at typical engagement ranges lasted between 12 and 30 seconds from first detection to end of engagement. Firing 2 seconds earlier meant getting off 1 additional aimed shot, sometimes 2. In engagements where both sides had clear shots and adequate ammunition, the crew that fired more aimed rounds faster, usually won. The stabilizer didn't guarantee victory, but it tilted probability in a direction that saved lives. Clinton Hanna received no medals for his contribution, no battlefield commendations, no public recognition beyond technical circles. The Army Ordnance Department sent a letter in April 1945, typewritten on official letterhead, with the bureaucratic language of organizations that acknowledge success without emotion. The gyroscopic gun stabilizer has proven invaluable in combat operations. Crew acceptance has increased substantially following enhanced training programs. System reliability under field conditions has exceeded initial expectations. Recommend continued development for post-war armored vehicle programs. The letter sat in Hannah's desk drawer for decades, a fragment of vindication for 18 months of obsessive engineering and 5 years of watching field reports that swung between triumph and rejection. He'd built a system that did exactly what the specification requested, kept tank guns steady while vehicles moved over rough terrain at speeds up to 15 mph. The fact that crews initially rejected it, that doctrine lagged behind capability. The training failed before hardware failed. None of that diminished the engineering achievement. He'd solved the problem everyone said was impossible, and eventually the people who needed it most learned to trust it. Post-war interviews with German Panzer crews revealed consistent themes that American intelligence analysts found both satisfying and unsettling. American tanks fired with abnormal speed and accuracy, one Panther commander explained through a translator. We assumed superior training initially, better crew selection, perhaps more practice time. When we examined captured Shermans, we found mechanical systems we did not understand. Gyroscopes, hydraulic controls, electrical servo mechanisms. We assumed it was related to fire control, but the integration was too complex to analyze in field conditions. Our engineers never explained it to us. We simply learned to expect that American tanks would fire first, and we adjusted tactics accordingly. They never understood the mechanical advantage because understanding required seeing the entire system in operation, calibrated and maintained and employed by crews who trusted it. Captured hardware revealed components, not integration. The victory wasn't in the parts. It was in the patient application of precision engineering to a problem everyone else had abandoned as unsolvable.